My uncle didn't yell when he fired me from a restaurant I didn't even work at. He just slid an envelope across the host stand in front of the Sunday brunch line and said, "Effective today, you're no longer family staff." I hadn't drawn a paycheck from Nikitas's table in 11 years. That was never the point. The point was who was watching him do it. 40 regulars in line for spanakopita, my cousins behind the register, and my grandfather, 91 years old, parked in his wheelchair by the window where Uncle Peter had started keeping him so he gets some sun. I want you to hold on to that detail about the window. It matters more than anything else I tell you today. Here's what nobody in that restaurant knew yet. 40 minutes earlier, a woman named Dorothy Okafor had walked into the county recorder's office holding a folder she'd been sitting on for 6 years and asked a very simple question that was about to end my uncle's restaurant empire before dessert service. If you're new to this channel, we tell the stories people write in about the quiet ones who get erased and what happens when the erasing finally catches up with the eraser. I'm Callie. I'm a paramedic, and this is the story of how my grandmother's handwriting, 6 years after her funeral, walked into a family business and took it apart one signature at a time. Let me take you back 9 years, because you can't understand what happened at that host stand without understanding what happened at a hospital bed first. My grandmother, Anna Nikitas, built that restaurant from a lunch counter in 1974. Everyone in the family will tell you Uncle Peter built it. He's the one who put his name on the awning, expanded to 3 locations, got written up in the city paper. What they don't advertise is that every square foot of it sat on land my grandmother inherited from her own father, land she never once transferred into Peter's name. Not in 50 years of marriage-adjacent business partnership between a mother and her son. I only found this out by accident in a hospital hallway the week she was dying. I was 26, 3 years into nursing school, when my mother, Anna's daughter, Peter's sister, got the call that changed everything about how I saw my family. Pancreatic cancer, caught late, the kind that gives you a calendar instead of a future. My mother drove the 2 hours to sit with her mother every weekend. I came when I could between clinicals. And Uncle Peter, who ran the business and therefore ran the family, ran his mother's dying the exact same way he ran inventory. He decided which doctor. He decided which visits were too much for her. And 3 weeks before she died, when the palliative team recommended round-the-clock hospice care, Peter told them the family would handle it themselves, because Nikita's women, he said, don't die in strangers' hands. My grandmother died in her own bed above the second restaurant location, in pain that a hospice nurse could have managed and didn't get the chance to, because my uncle didn't want strangers seeing the family's business. I have never forgiven him for that sentence. I'm not going to pretend otherwise for the rest of this story. At the funeral reception, and yes, we are already back at a reception because apparently my family can't grieve without a buffet involved, Peter stood up mid-meal and announced in front of 60 people that I had disrespected the family by asking too many questions at the hospital, that I'd made his mother's dying about my nursing school opinions. He didn't say I was cut off, he didn't have to. My mother's own siblings stopped inviting me to Sunday dinner within a month. My name came off the family group chat within 2. Here's the part that still gets me. I kept driving up on my grandfather's birthday every year anyway, just to sit in the restaurant's back booth for 20 minutes where I could see him without walking through the front door where Peter held court. 6 birthdays, 6 20-minute visits. And on the 7th one, the one where Peter caught me at the host stand and fired me from a job I never had, I finally learned what those 6 years had actually been buying. Because 2 hours before I got there, Dorothy Okafor had opened a folder that had been sealed in her office safe since the week my grandmother died. Dorothy wasn't family. She was my grandmother's accountant of 30 years, a sharp, unhurried woman who did my grandmother's books back when the restaurant was 1 register and a coffee urn. She found me in the parking lot after Peter walked away, before I'd even gotten back in my car, and she said 4 words that rearranged my whole afternoon. Your grandmother left instructions. I want to tell you exactly what instructions meant because it is not what you think. 6 years earlier, in that same dying bed, my grandmother had done something my uncle never once suspected. She'd moved the deed to all 3 restaurant properties, land Peter had never had legal claim to, into an irrevocable trust, with Dorothy as sole trustee. Not out of spite, out of arithmetic. She'd watched her son manage her death the way he managed a walk-in cooler, and she wanted to make sure that if he ever did that to one of her grandchildren, there would be a door nobody could lock from the inside. The trust had one trigger clause. If Peter Nikitas ever publicly disowned or humiliated a family member the way he'd humiliated me at that hospital, the clause was written that specifically. The trust would immediately convert from silent landlord to active owner. He tripped the wire himself at a host stand in front of the brunch line, holding an envelope he thought was mine to receive. Dorothy handed me a card with an address on it. Not the restaurant, her office, the next morning, 9 a.m. "Bring your grandfather's medication list," she said, which confused me until I understood 3 hours later exactly why she'd asked for it. I want to pause here and ask you something because I think about it more than almost anything else in this story. Have you ever found out that someone who seemed to have given up on protecting you had actually been protecting you the whole time, just quietly from somewhere you couldn't see? Tell me in the comments how long it took you to notice. I didn't sleep that night. I drove to my grandfather's care schedule the next morning instead of Dorothy's office, because something about the window detail had been sitting wrong in my chest for hours, and paramedics learn to trust the thing sitting wrong before we trust anything else. I got to the restaurant's upstairs apartment, where my grandfather had lived alone since my grandmother died, and let myself in with the spare key my mother didn't know I still had. What I found stopped me in the doorway the way very few scenes ever have, and I've worked a decade of emergency calls. My grandfather, Nikos, 91, had lost visible weight since his last birthday. Not gradually, sharply. There was a folding chair set up by the window overlooking the parking lot, a blanket, and nothing else in that corner but a chair, which told me exactly how many hours a day he spent there being given sun instead of company. His pill organizer had 4 medications doubled up in the same compartment and 2 missing entirely. And on the counter, unopened, was a stack of mail 3 weeks deep, including 2 notices from his cardiologist's office marked "Please respond." I photographed all of it, not out of vengeance. Out of a professional reflex I've never once regretted trusting. Then I found the second thing, the one that had nothing to do with medication. Tucked behind the silverware drawer in a rubber-banded bundle were birthday cards. Dozens of them. Every single one addressed to me in my grandfather's shaking handwriting, stamped, sealed, and never mailed. 6 years of cards, 1 per birthday, sitting in a kitchen drawer 300 feet from a mailbox. I sat down on his kitchen floor and cried in a way I hadn't let myself do since the hospital hallway, because I finally understood something that 6 years of silence had convinced me was true and was never true at all. My grandfather hadn't forgotten me. Somebody had been intercepting both directions of a conversation, the same way people intercept a signal, and letting 2 people believe the silence was mutual when it had never once belonged to either of us. He woke up in his recliner while I was still on the floor, looked at me the way people look at a face they've been waiting to place, and said, "Peter told me you stopped visiting. Every year I asked." I want you to sit with that sentence for 1 second before I keep going, because it's the hinge this whole story turns on. I called the state's adult protective line from his kitchen, the way my training required, and reported exactly what I'd seen. No embellishment, no family politics, just documented facts, medication, mismanagement, isolation, unanswered medical correspondence. Then I did the harder thing. I called Dorothy and told her I was going to be late to her office, because I needed to bring my grandfather somewhere safe first. She didn't ask why. She said, "Bring him here too." Here's what I learned in Dorothy's office that afternoon, laid out across her desk in the order my grandmother had apparently planned for 6 years. The trust hadn't just been sitting quietly holding property. It had been quietly funding the restaurant's survival. 2 bad years, a kitchen fire at the second location, a walk-in that needed replacing. Every time Peter's business should have gone under from mismanagement and thin margins, the trust had covered the gap without him ever knowing where the money came from. My grandmother had spent her final signature buying her son 7 more years of pretending he was self-made. Why keep saving him? I asked, if she knew what he'd already done to her dying. Dorothy's answer is the one I still think about most. Because she wasn't protecting Peter, she said. She was protecting the business long enough for it to still be worth handing to whoever earned it honestly. She just needed to see, eventually, who that was. The trigger clause had already fired. Dorothy laid out the 2 paths in front of me the way you'd lay out 2 patients' charts. Full transfer of ownership to me, effective immediately, 3 locations, the land, the succession, everything Peter had spent 30 years believing was his, or a restructuring of my own design, which Dorothy would execute exactly as I wrote it. I'm not going to pretend the first option didn't tempt me. For about 4 seconds, I let myself picture walking back into that restaurant and being the one who got to point at the door. It felt exactly as good as you'd think, and that's precisely why I didn't trust it. I asked for one night, and Dorothy, who I think had been hoping I'd ask for exactly that, told me to take 2. Peter found out by Thursday the way these things always travel, and he did something he had never once done in 6 years. He drove to my apartment, stood on my doorstep in his chef's coat, hat literally in his hands, and offered me the only currency he'd ever understood. "Come back," he said. "Sunday dinners, your name back in the chat. All you have to do is tell that woman to leave the ownership as it was." He'd priced my forgiveness at exactly the value of his own convenience, and he did it without once mentioning my grandfather. I told him I'd give him my answer at the family meeting Dorothy was already scheduling. He left satisfied, the way a man leaves when he's never once heard no arrive on time. Friday, in a conference room with a view of the restaurant's original location, I read my own page aloud instead of accepting either of Dorothy's prepared documents. I declined full ownership permanently. The room went silent in the exact specific way a room goes silent when a script it was prepared for stops matching reality. Then I read the terms I'd actually written. My grandfather would have full medical guardianship transferred to me with professional in-home care funded by the trust for the rest of his life. No exceptions, no saucers of hand-mixed pills. The second restaurant location, the one my grandmother had run herself before Peter ever touched a spatula, would be converted into a subsidized community dining room for the neighborhood's elderly, staffed and funded permanently by the trust named for her. Peter would keep lifetime use of the flagship location under a real, audited lease at fair market rate, no ownership, no authority over anything bearing our grandmother's name ever again. He said the word strangers like it was an accusation. I told him the only stranger in that building had been him to his own father for 6 years running. My grandfather moved into professional care within the month, gained back 11 pounds by spring, and sits by a real window now. One with a door beside it he's allowed to walk through. The dining room opened in March. We named it for my grandmother in letters visible from the road. It seats 40 on a slow day, feeds elderly neighbors who'd otherwise eat alone, and my grandfather holds court there every Tuesday like he invented brunch himself. Peter still runs the flagship location. Under a lease he actually has to justify every year now. He tells his version at his own dinner table, I'm told. The ungrateful niece, the accountant who meddled, the family business taken from him. Some people still nod along. I've made peace with the ones who do. I kept one of those unsent birthday cards. I didn't read it. My grandfather asked to read it to me himself, out loud, on a Tuesday, in a dining room with his mother's name over the door. It said exactly what 6 unmailed years should have said all along. I never stopped being proud of you. My grandmother spent the last strength she had building a door nobody could lock from the inside. I only ever had to stop believing the silence on the other side of it was real. If you've ever found out that the person who seemed to have given up on you never actually did, tell me in the comments what door finally opened for you and who was quietly holding it. Subscribe if you want more of these. I'm Callie. Thanks for staying till the last table was cleared.